Section 1. Background. There is a long history in the United States and the Gogebic Range of labor organizers being labeled as agitators and being driven out of town. Violence on the part of the strikers and authorities was common enough thing. It happened at least as far back as 1894 in Gogebic County and again in 1937. The scene of thugs beating up workers as depicted in The Grapes of Wrath seems to be typical of those times, as they did use axe handles to beat people, just as shown in the movies. As I develop this history, I will include accounts of the battles waged by the striking lumberjacks and the forces of the local establishment during the 1937 strike. There's little doubt the 1937 strike involved communist agitation. My impression of it is that it was instigated by folks who were dedicated or idealist communists, and that the lumberjacks were ripe pickings not because of any deep belief in communist ideology, but because they were only too happy to get out of the camps and away from the routine of working for little more than 30 cents an hour and sleeping in crowded and sometimes louse-infested bunkhouses. They stood to win some pay increases and improvements in the common workplace if the strike succeeded. The union organizers came here from Minnesota, where they had successfully formed a timber workers union after striking in December of 1936. Minnesota Governor Elmer Benson, the Farmer Labor Party, kept logging trucks off the roads until the strike was settled, thus preventing violence. Unions without teeth tended to lead to frustration, especially in the hard times of the Great Depression. This lesson was lost on the people in Michigan and in Gogebic County. Local businesses and professional people and law enforcement officers were mostly anti-union. The jobbers were determined to ignore the union and haul their logs to market. Some local newspapers, possibly on purpose or perhaps unintentionally, managed to stir up anti-union sentiment that led to police brutality and vigilante activity. The union organizers were denounced as agitators, outsiders, and communists. Local lumberjacks were pictured as unwilling participants in a strike foisted upon them by these outsiders. As things got out of hand, the blame was placed entirely upon the lumberjacks, who were described as being violent individuals, many of them who were not even American citizens. The charges of communist involvement were true, but those few individuals with communist connections generally did not publicize their political affiliations. They were primarily interested in helping in the organization of a union. It was also true that many were outsiders, but this is frequently the case when unions are formed. When the lumberjacks at Bonifas Camp 2 walked off their jobs on the 18th of May, 1937, it became a strike that lasted almost 4 months and spread as far east as Newberry. The newspapers of the time were full of news about other strikes taking place across the state and the nation. The strikes against Little Steel and Henry Ford were in progress in the summer of 1937. Gus Hall, who would later head the Communist Party USA, was involved in the CIO's activities. 1,200 WPA workers in Gogebic County struck in July. Strike fever was spreading as workers were just beginning to learn of their newly guaranteed rights to organize. Section 2. Communist Involvement in Union Organization. The Communist Party USA began the decade with fewer than 10,000 members and grew to over 90,000 by 1939. The Communists established the Trade Union Unity League to compete with the American Federation of Labor, and the period of the summer of 1935 to the August of 1939 known as the Popular Front era of American communism, when they adapted the tactic of appealing to all possible allies in their struggle against fascism, while putting aside their desire to overthrow the government. The local communists contacted Minnesota Timber Workers Local 2776, and Frank Arvela became the head of the new Michigan Timber Workers Local 2530, which served as its charter from the AFL. John W. Mackey of Ironwood described the newspaper report as a one-time communist candidate for lieutenant governor, helped organize the Timber Workers Union. The Timber Worker, published in Duluth, Minnesota, was the official organ of the timber and sawmill workers, connected with the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, which represented over 5,000 workers in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The Minnesota people got in touch with the Finnish communists in Ironwood, who then secured a charter for the American Federation of Labor preparatory to organize the lumberjacks. Frank Arvela, the local communist activist, made plans to meet with the sawmill workers in Marinesco and Ironwood. A man called Luke Rake, a former Wobbly, whose real name was Louis Reykjavik, was the president of the Ironwood Local in June 1937. Rake was Rake was recruited by the communists to serve on a relief committee for striking lumberjacks. I remember Luke Rake in the 1930s. He was kind of a tall looking lumberjack, said Bob Anderson. I remember him getting all kinds of communist literature that came in the big bundles into Maradesco Depot. They always claimed that the Union at the time was kind of infiltrated by the communists and that Luke Rake was a communist. I don't know. Luke Rake was described by Clarence Reisky as a big guy, pretty good sized guy. He talked up a storm, but he wasn't doing much good. Matt Savala, called the Iron River Agitator, was brought in by John Wida to serve on the strike committee. Savala, 29 years old, was a Communist Party section organizer. John Wida, also known as Henry Pirro, once served as the editor of a Finnish communist newspaper in Canada in the early 20th century. By 1925, he was living in the United States and was a Politburo member. The Communist Party placed him in charge of directing the agrarian work in 1930, bringing farmers into the party. Wida, or Pirro as he was known, was next appointed a district organizer in the remote Upper Michigan. Pirro's memoirs are mentioned in the Bernhardt History, which carries this quotation. When I took over the district, party membership was overwhelmingly the same as the Finnish Federation local club's membership. Pirro served as district organizer in the Upper Peninsula from 1935 to 1938. Section 4. William Bonifas. William, Big Bill Bonifas, died in November of 1936, so he never lived to see the lumberjack strike begin 6 months later. Miss Edna Fermer, a famous writer, visited Ironwood in 1933 to collect material for her novel, Come and Get It, a fictional account of Hurley, Wisconsin, Lottie Morgan, and the old lumberjack barons and jacks. Miss Ferber later recorded in her autobiography, A Peculiar Treasure, her disappointment in discovering the local lumber barons were only more examples of the great eastern and western robber barons. She feigned surprise that none of the robber barons, noted for their ruthless exploitation and acquisition of wealth and power, were Jewish. During her trip, she met William Bonifas. Aside from his actual business acumen and wealth, he and his wife were ordinary, unsophisticated people. Miss Ferber was invited to stay in their home, apparently the place on Lake Gogebic. She mentioned that the lack of books anywhere in the home. While guests were having dinner, Bonifas began to talk about Jewish bankers were attempting to seize control of the world. Their guests went along with it until she told everybody that she happened to be Jewish. Then everyone stopped talking and gave her dirty looks. The following day, she was given a hard time when she tried to carry out a planned visit to one of the logging camps in the area. William Bonifas was one of the last of Michigan's old famous lumber barons, the men who sometimes amassed fortunes by cutting down as many pine trees as they could get their hands on, sometimes paying as little as $50 for a 40. Bonifas carried his career about 1885, soon after emigrating from Luxembourg. He ended up in Escanaba and started cutting railroad ties, eventually developing a profitable business of his own. One of the big breaks came when he became an agent for GM and Fisher Body, purchasing timberlands from them in the western Upper Peninsula. Bonifas also became associated with Kimberly-Clark in 1912, and by 1936 drew an annual salary of $45,000. This, combined with his other investments, made him a millionaire several times over. He built what later became the 500 Bushel Club on the south shore of Lake Gogebic at a cost of $100,000. In 1928, Bonifas bought out the sawmill in Marinesco, bankrupt Charcoal Iron Company of America. He and his wife, Catherine, were extremely frugal, but parsimonious couple became great philanthropists. They gave millions to various churches and schools, and only a small percentage went to friends and relatives. They had no children. There's the home. There's a pic of the logging camp. Lives of the old-time lumberjacks. Lumberjacks at Bonifas Lumber Company Camp 2 walked out on the 18th of May, 1937. The strikers demanded a 40-hour work week, 55 cents an hour, running water, or showers, white sheets on their bunks, and meals for transient lumberjacks. Steve Pavlovic gave this account. The lumberjack strike was all just to get showers and better places for the guys, with bathrooms and everything. I went to work in 1936 with my dad cutting logs out by Camp 4. We walked 2 or 3 miles from the camp through the woods in the dark. We made about $3 or $4 a day. They brought food out there on a bobsled, and you eat that stuff with your hands, it will be freezing. The lumberjacks wanted to eat their meals inside a heated building. They wanted electric generators for light instead of kerosene lanterns. I don't think there was too much said about wages. I never seen any bed bugs. There was some. Years ago, outdoor toilet wasn't so bad, but they wanted hot water for taking showers. When I worked in Camp 4, they had a big stove when I first started to work, and the bull cooks turned slabs to heat it. They had socks and clothes hanging around it, and it stunk so bad. We had a wash tub, soap and scrub brush for washing our clothes, if we washed them. There they are, washing clothes out in the middle of the snow. That's just how it was done. Camp 2 was called Bonneville. It was situated on the Cisco branch of the Ontonagon River east of Lake Gogebic. Access was by railroad tracks, 3 miles of company track with the remainder belonging to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. There were 2 bunkhouses at Camp 2, capable of housing 110 men. Along with bunkhouses, there was a cookhouse and the office. The lumberjacks slept in double bunks and had barrel stoves for heat. There were tubs of water outside for washing clothes, and sometimes clothing and sheets were thrown into a big tub and boiled. Addie Conley said, "There weren't any bed bugs in there. They kept them clean and washed our boots off in the creek before going into the bunkhouses. Red, the cook, was from Waters Meat. He could really cook. We had cream pies, roast beef and gravy, potatoes, carrots, bacon, pancakes, canned fruits, and syrup. The lunch counter was open any time somebody came in." Back in the old days, many lumberjacks avoided bathing during the winter, and by springtime the bunkhouses would become vermin-infested and very smelly. Bedbugs and lice flourished under such conditions and made life miserable for anybody with the misfortune to find himself spending the night in a certain logging camps. Clarence Allen was a conservation officer in Marinesco in the 1920s and 1930s, and once had to take shelter in one of the camps after the crankcase of his car was damaged. When I got to the camp, I was tired that I couldn't even eat. The cook says, "You gonna stay with us all night?" I said, "Well, you're gonna have a heck of a time chasing me out of here." I was beginning to worry that I'd have to sleep in the bunkhouse. In them days, the cooties was pretty thick, and I thought, boy, here's what I was going to get, good and lousy. The cook said, you can sleep with me, so I thought that will be fine. When I jumped out of the hornet's nest right into the fire, because that old guy was so lousy, it was a wonder that they didn't carry me away. Next morning, I got up, and he fixed a good breakfast and lunch. I took off across the woods. I got about halfway, and I started feeling itchy and wondered where the heck was wrong. I went home to my mother-in-law's place and took off my underwear. I counted 25 cooties stuck in the underwear, and the rest of them I throwed in the stove and burned them. Matt Savola came up with the slogan, "Lumberjacks Unite. All you've got to lose is your bedbugs." Martha Koski, secrist, said her mother made lumberjacks who stayed out at the farm at Green take a sauna every Saturday night before she would be allowed them in the house for dinner. There were 8 of them, and they thought it was a punishment. One of the lumber camp operators was quoted as saying he always felt that single beds for lumberjacks was a good idea, and that every time we built a new camp, we provided single beds. But when it comes to paying 55 cents an hour to lumberjacks, that can't be considered, until the operators were getting a great deal more for their logs. Lumberjacks were being paid as little as 27 cents an hour. They were paid by check and had about $1 a day deducted from room and board if they stayed in the logging camp. Mill workers in town were generally family men and were sometimes paid in tokens that could be used to make purchases in the company store. The tokens were made of aluminum and issued in denominations of 25 cents, 50 cents, and $1 for the Bonifas mills in Marinesco and Winnegar, and denominations from 1 cent to $1 for former mills at Bonifas, north of Waters Meat. John Capo said he went to work in 1935 for 29 cents an hour, working 6 10-hour days. Some lumberjacks worked for $1 a day plus free board. If a lumberjack earned 30 cents an hour and actually got 6 days of work for 52 weeks, which is unlikely, he would have grossed $936, minus about $355 for room and board, resulting in a net of $571. I did a little bit of inflation math. 27 cents an hour was about $5 an hour in today's wages. So 50 cents was just a little less than $11 an hour. They were doing jack work for $1 an hour.